Right. Very good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for joining us today at the ISAS panel discussion on reshaping relations, the US-India tech partnership. This panel will focus on India-US technology relationship and partnership in the wake of Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi's recent visit to the US that resulted in critical announcements to advance bilateral technological cooperation. It will also cover the geopolitics of technological partnership given major power tensions, its potential to help India advance domestic digital initiatives, and where potential irritants lie that could slow the current momentum. Today, we're delighted to have with us as guest speakers, Mr. Nitin Pai, co-founder and director, Takshashila Institution, India, and non-resident senior fellow, Institute of South Asian Studies, National University of Singapore. Mr. Arindrajit Basu, non-resident fellow, Center for Internet and Society, India, and PhD candidate, Leiden University. This session will be chaired by Dr. Karthik Nachiappan, research fellow, Institute of South Asian Studies, National University of Singapore. Today's session will be live streamed on the ISAS Facebook page. I shall now invite Dr. Nachiappan to commence the panel discussion, please.
Great. Thank you so much, Tanuj. I want to just welcome you all again to this virtual discussion on US-India technology ties. We have two terrific guest speakers to cover recent shifts in US-India tech relations, and they've already been introduced. But before that, let's just take a step back and talk briefly about the issue that's going to be the focus of this virtual discussion. The last few years has seen transformational cooperation between the United States and India in terms of technology. The most recent capstone is the announcement of ISAS, the US-India initiative on critical and emerging technology to elevate and expand strategic partnerships across a gamut of technology issues like semiconductors, space, 5G, and digital public goods between both governments, but also now other actors like businesses, scientific and academic institutions. Beyond bilateral partnership, the United States and India are also working with Japan and Australia through the Quad's working group on critical and emerging technologies, working again on similar issues like space, semiconductors, and 5G. Globally, both countries also seek to shape the ways in which technology is developed, designed, governed, and used globally based on certain shared values and interests, which also includes deterring other countries from misusing such technologies. The big question is, can their partnership achieve that global objective? By trying to deepen the tech partnership across these levels, the bilateral, the multilateral, and the minilateral, both the United States and India are also shedding longstanding inhibitions that have prevented both parties from close technological cooperation over the years. Their budding tech partnership is also important given prevailing geopolitical and geoeconomic competition between major powers, which is affecting India-US ties and how they can help each other confront and address each other's strategic challenges. Technology could become central, not a sideshow in US-India relations going forward. So this panel will cover the India-US tech partnership and relationship in the wake of Prime Minister Modi's recent visit to the United States that resulted in several critical announcements to advance bilateral tech cooperation. It will also cover the geopolitics of the tech partnership, as I said, given major power tensions in the international order, and also its potential to help India advance certain domestic digital initiatives, like the DPIs, digital public infrastructures. And also, finally, we'll talk a little bit about where potential irritants lie that could slow the current momentum. We have two great experts and panelists to help us make sense of what's been happening on the technological side between the US and India. Both have written extensively on India's technology policy and governance and its transformation from different lenses, and are well placed to comment on the tech partnership. Our first guest is Nitin Pai, co-founder and director of Takshashila Institution, India. Nitin is also a non-resident senior fellow, ISAS, and Arindrajit Basu, non-resident fellow at the Center for Internet and Society, and a PhD candidate at Leiden University. In terms of the format, Nitin, Arindrajit, and I will have a conversation on US-India tech ties for about 30 to 40 minutes, where we will cover some of the key developments from Prime Minister Modi's visit to the United States and its implications, and then move to a Q&A with the audience. So I want to first begin with a few general questions to both Nitin and Arindrajit. And maybe I can start with you, with Nitin. What is your general assessment of Prime Minister Modi's visit to the United States from a technology point of view?
Hi, Karthik, Arindrajit. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for having me on your program. I think the first and the most important thing which came out of that visit is a sort of putting a form to something which has been happening for the last several years, easily the last 5 years, where there's an increasing convergence in terms of interests, in terms of capabilities and worldviews in a geopolitical sense. And because the geopolitics is occurring in the information age, in the technological sense as well. So let me give you an example, right? I think everybody sort of looks at it and says, this is the geopolitics is being shuffled because of China's rise, and a whole lot of things are happening with respect to China. That is true. That is just one part of it. But there's also a growing understanding that the way technology platforms have proliferated around the world, the kind of effects technology platforms, social media, etc., are having on liberal democratic societies and on the way influence occurs, right? Both internationally and within the country. There have been convergences of worldviews on these aspects. I use the word convergence very carefully because it doesn't mean coincidence, right? The two countries don't agree on everything onto a single point, but there's a growing convergence. And the growing convergence is coming both because of geopolitical factors, China, etc., balance of power, but also with a more sophisticated policy understanding of what technology is doing to our societies and what we must do to handle technological change in our societies, right? And there's that growing convergence. And the convergence is also happening with Australia to a great extent. Now, when the Prime Minister and the President met, it was also an occasion to consummate some of the more tricky tech policy issues that needed political determination. Now, I'll give you an example is of space, right? The Artemis Accords being one of them. Takshashila has advocated for India's signing of the Artemis Accords for a very long time, right? And there's a significant body of opinion in the Indian space establishment that we shouldn't do it, because that's the trajectory, right? That's the trajectory in which the Indian space establishment has evolved. Thanks to the sanctions regimes of the 80s and the 90s, there's a considerable opinion within the establishment that any such collaboration will be to our detriment, which might impair our ability to do things on our own. And since we have the ability to do things on our own, why not we do them? Why do we need to get into a cooperative arrangement with anybody, especially the United States? So that's a little bit of the Cold War hangover. But there's also a spring of confidence in this establishment that we can do things alone. And then there's the counter view, which people like us have proposed that, look, this is an entirely new world. There are entirely new different possibilities out there. India speaks in the technology space with greater confidence than it ever did. So it's in our interest to, participate in the Artemis Accords, because you will be pushing forward the frontiers of space technology and space achievement for humankind as a whole, and not in terms of pure national terms. Now, this issue requires a political determination, right? It's not something which can be sorted out on its own through the normal policy processes. And for a determination to happen, there needs to be a compelling event. So the compelling event came in the form of the Prime Minister's visit to the United States, where you needed to have something significant to sign off on, and therefore the Artemis signing happened, right? So there are a lot of smaller things like this, which because of the compelling event got signed off, and in that sense accelerated maybe we gained maybe 3 to 5 years in many cases, right? Otherwise, these things would have kept hanging around for 3-5 years, and then finally it will happen. But because of the compelling event, it happened now. So that's I think what I would see as sort of a putting the formal signatures on, or maybe consummation of many things which had to happen anyway.
Before I move to Arinderjit, I want to just pick up on one point that you mentioned, Nitin, about the sanctions regime in the 80s and 90s, which seems to have thwarted close tech cooperation between the US and India, at least until now. So politics, as you mentioned, is a big part of it. But I'm wondering if you can just talk a little bit more about India becoming better aware of its own technological situation and position. How important is that relative to the geopolitical and the political factors?
Well, they're both intertwined. But the big difference, and Karthik, you are the person who wrote the book on negotiation, so you know this better than any one of us. But I think the big difference between the 80s and the 2020s is who's doing the technology, right? Where does the technology establishment lie? In the 80s, the technology establishment was largely in the hands of the state. So you had government labs doing, high-end research in supercomputing, in space, in missiles, in nuclear, and genetics, and so on. They were largely government concentrated, right? And there were some public sector units which are also, in a way, government-supported entities which are doing this kind of research. So the technological base was in the hands of the state. In 2023, I think a large part of the technological base is in the private sector, right? And it's also not just in the private sector, it's also in areas which are so far out of the government's purview that government probably doesn't even account for it, right? So again, space is an example. Up until 2018, there were a huge number of space-related startups in the country which the government had no clue about, right? The government didn't know. The space industry was blooming on its own. And it's only in 2019, due to a few events, part of which we were involved, where the space industry came into the radar screen of the government, right? Now you have, hundreds of space startups. In the last 6 months alone, I think there was close to $400 million of investments which went into space startups in India, right? So there are a lot of things happening like this, which I would call the non-governmental space. And it's vibrant, it's confident, it's in a way not too worried about its own failure, because it's different if you're in a big government lab, right, where failure has costs, it has reputation costs, it has budget costs and so forth. But if you're a small startup trying different things and you fail, you just fail. It's fine, So I think that's the attitudinal change also which you see in the space industry. So there are two changes. One, its location from movement of its location from public to private, and the second, in the kind of attitudes and mindsets researchers have, which is very, very different in 2023 than it was in the 80s.
Okay. I do want to bring you in here, Arinderjit. Do you share Nitin's assessment on the visit? And also, if I can get your take on the public-private divide on the technology front in India.
Yeah, thanks, Karthik. Real privilege to, I think I froze for a second, but hope I'm still audible. Real privilege to be here with you and Nitin. And already I think both of you have laid the groundwork for what I wanted to speak about. But let me use your opening and what Nitin has said to kind of go deeper into 4 aspects of the visit and relationships. Obviously, there's the security/defense aspect. There is the economic/trade aspect. The third is the domestic policy convergence aspect. And the fourth is, of course, the rulemaking at various global forums that you referred to. So very quickly on all 4 of these, and a lot of these will be going a little bit deeper into what Nitin has already mentioned. So thanks for making these great points already, Nitin. So on the security assessment, I think that's the real focus of that technology in the joint statement, right? So just, for those of you, I'm sure everyone knows this already. I'm sure the joint statement is bedside reading, but just to give a few examples, right? So there is the India-US quantum partnership that was spoken about. There was a semiconductor MOU that was signed, and in the same paragraph, there was reference to Micron setting up some sort of facility in India, right? So there is a private sector company that is being referred to in bilateral political joint statement. And that speaks to what Nitin was suggesting in terms of the technology relationship, not only moving towards the private sector, but also the government very much acknowledging that in some way that is where much of the capacity lies, right? There was a joint task force set up on standards and Open RAN, again from the security perspective. Indus X, which was a consortium of a startup incubator for defense companies. So on the security front, there is very much a realization that technology is critical for security, emerging technologies, quantum, AI, semiconductors, and that the private sector will be involved in this critical sector. Nitin's already mentioned space, right? So that's I think a major win, something where there is convergence on. The economic and trade aspect of it is a bit more complicated. So when we talk about the proliferation of platforms and so on, that's where there is far fewer convergence. So the joint statement itself was entirely silent on digital trade. It did mention the need to kind of some disputes were relaxed and so on at the WTO. They didn't concern digital trade, and there has been a number of statements made by Gina Raimondo in her interactions with Minister Piyush Goyal, suggesting that cross-border flows are important, that digital trade needs to be sorted out through the US-India Trade Policy Forum. But this statement that contains so much on security didn't contain as much on trade, and there are obvious reasons for that. There is obviously disagreement, and we can go into it into these issues in more depth later on. But on India's equalization levy, which is essentially a digital tax on the US GAFAs, there is disagreement on some of India's domestic policy, such as the compliance requirements on online intermediaries. Disagreement still on data localization, despite the recent bill being much more liberal, but there is the existing sectoral notifications remain. So there is, again, while there is a desire to, of course, for there to be private-public convergence in the security and defense realm, when we talk about domestic policy convergence that would kind of result in, say, an immediate trade relationship, either at the plurilateral forum or a bilateral FTA, that is yet to come about, and it really depends on how these other forums, how talks at these other forums progress. So another example is that India has still not signed the or has not been a part of the trade pillar of the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, even though India is a part of the other three pillars being brokered by the US. So there is, again, convergence on security and defense when it comes to tech. Trade, a bit more complicated, conversations are happening. And that obviously, and I referred to this a little bit in terms of the larger diplomatic and political setting. I think that means the reason why the US-India technology relationship has come so far is because the US-India relationship has come far, where the oft-quoted hesitations of history have, been put aside by both sides, where I think Raja Mohan himself argued this in a recent op-ed, which I thought put it really well, that the US looked at the world in terms of alliances, and now they are, quantifying their view of relationships with other countries. And India was always a little wary of partnering with the US, because that would maybe be perceived as an alliance which was never in India's policy. So again, there is a realization that there can be meaningful convergences on certain issues that include the private sector, while each country recognizing that there are meaningful divergences based on national interest. So just because the US trade representative continues to see data localization as a trade barrier, does not mean that there cannot be meaningful cooperation on all the things that Nitin mentioned and the other things that are there in the joint statement. And that is good for diplomacy writ large. But in terms of, again, rulemaking, I think, and we can go into the specific forum separately, there, of course, the fact that there is convergence on security means that at the Quad, for example, there is some basic convergence on the rules and principles that govern technology, and there is a Quad statement and so on. But if we look at, say, India's and the US positions at the United Nations First Committee that looks at cybersecurity, again, trade, the trade regime that includes both plurilateral initiatives, the WTO and the IPF and so on, definite divergence. And again, based on what people find interesting, we can go into some of these in more detail, but I'll stop there for now.
I want to move to the big initiative out of the visit. In the joint statement, both countries referred to ISAT as a technology partnership for the future. The ISAT in itself, both leaders hope that the that cooperation will ensue through ISAT on issues like semiconductors, space, quantum computing, AI, and other issues. I'm wondering first, as I was reading and thinking about ISAT, I was wondering first, how is this going to happen? Because it looks to me like this is more or less a top-down effort to get these two dynamic entrepreneurial innovation ecosystems to work together. One interesting aspect of ISAT is that the national security councils of both countries will coordinate the initiative, bringing other ministries, departments, and agencies to work with their counterparts and deliver on specific on goals. So how is this going to happen? And is there sufficient buy-in domestically amongst different actors in India? Maybe I'll go to Nitin first and then back to Anuj.
Yeah, I think the most interesting part about the ISET is that the principal stakeholders on both sides are the national security advisors. And that tells you a lot of about what this is about, right? There is definitely a civilian and a commercial dimension to this. But I think the primary focus of this is strategic, right? I think it's one way of looking at it is, I think the establishments have figured out that technology is a very important instrument of statecraft, of national security. And it's not just a trade or a commerce or a technology or a social kind of an issue. It is something which the national security advisors need to be concerned about. Now, that means, at least on the Indian side, coordination, I think, is very, I always get very amused when people talk about coordination in the Indian sense, right? India is a complex adaptive system. You can't coordinate things, in the way that you would probably do it in a smaller country, right? It is a complex adaptive system. You can nudge and guide the system towards desired objectives. You can prevent some very nasty things from happening, and you can sort of mitigate the damage when bad things happen, right? So you can't coordinate. You can't expect Indian industry to move forward in a rank and file fashion towards a desired objective, and I don't think that's even desirable, even if that's possible. But what it means here is that when there are projects and there are issues which are critical to national security in the technology domain, you now have a route to get things cleared. Right? You don't necessarily have to move through the state government or the union government of electronics and IT or commerce ministry, finance ministry, etc. If there are projects which are cross-cutting, which are critical, for either mutually critical or critical for one side, they pass through the National Security Council. So in that way, you can accelerate the movement of certain projects. Now, industry behavior will be to classify everything as strategic and try to move through this special queue that exists. And I think that's where the competence of the civil servants and the policymakers on both sides exist. How do you classify what is critical and let pass through? I'll give you one example. Clearest kind of things which would let's say you have designed a particular way to optimize mobile telephony signals in a 5G kind of a environment, right? And this is proprietary technology. Maybe a lab in India or the United States has invented this, and now you want to get this into government networks or public networks as quickly as possible. Now you have a route called ICET to take this through, right? It's a faster route. It doesn't mean that you get to bypass safety standards, security standards, and etc. But it does mean that you get an accelerated walk through the bureaucratic and the compliance system, which can be onerous in both countries. I mean, I used to think that the Indian compliance system is onerous. That's only until I saw how it works in the US and then realized, oh my God, these guys are bad. Just don't have as bad a reputation as the Indian bureaucracy does. But it's the same, right? So I think that's the I'm not going to read verse and chapter into this, but I'm going to read this as a commitment by the security leadership on both sides to allow technology projects which are of mutual interest to sail through the system very, very quickly.
Before I move to Anurjit, I want to just follow up and ask about the political economy logic in India. There's obviously a strategic logic, which Nitin mentioned, that's driving ISET. How will that collide and intersect with the political economy logic in India, either the Indian state or the Indian private sector, when a large amount of American tech companies, might use ISET to expand their market space and their market presence in India? Nitin, do you want to just quickly talk about that before I move?
Yeah, sure. See, I think that's fine, in the sense that if you have foreign companies expanding market share in India or Indian companies expanding market share in the United States, by virtue of, it's like there's a let's call it jumping the queue, right? That's fine, because you're talking about two partners whose values and interests are aligned, and in a way we're dealing with some kind of a pushback against globalization, right? So these are all methods to deal with the pushback against globalization. I mean, if you had multilateral free trade, you wouldn't need any of these special queues and special systems to get into each other's markets, right? So in a way, this is a way to bypass it. And if companies do business with each other because of this route, so it's fine. I mean, you might have some bean counter somewhere worrying about, oh my God, these guys have jumped the queue and they're expanding market share, etc. But nothing nefarious is going on, nothing sinister is going on. This is just normal business, which is happening through a different route.
I want to get to you, Anurjit. Maybe you can also talk a little bit about how would you measure ISET's success, given the kinds of issues that they're going to be focusing on: space, quantum, AI, DPIs.
Yeah, I think that's a tough one, simply because the political economy is so in India is complex, right? So what would be a measure for success in the short term? What would be a measure for success in the medium and longer term are difficult questions to conceptualize and also to answer. But let me try and kind of give a sense of what I feel would or I feel that the private sector, because I think Nitin already spoke about what this means for the NSAs and the government to actually align, but what is the kind of private sector looking at when it comes to ISET and then separately to the DPIs as well, right? So there is, of course, a very vibrant startup ecosystem in various parts of India, both, of course, in Bangalore, also in Delhi, NCR and others, who are interested in getting involved in the defense space. And previously, there was always and still today, the fact that there are bureaucratic processes that prevent companies from doing business across the border. So I think one simple measure of success is what Nitin already mentioned, that if there are ways in which Indian businesses and US businesses wanting to do business with each other find, or with in the other country, find that the ISET has somehow reduced even a little bit not necessarily the rules themselves, but the ways in which the rules are applied or the speed with which the rules are applied for them to continue doing business. I think that is the perception of businesses themselves is potentially a measure of success. With DPIs in particular, I think we can start putting our hands around another potential measure for success, because there is already been a push at the diplomatic level outside the security establishment as well. I mean, pretty much any joint statement that India, both the Prime Minister and India has been involved with, including at the G20, includes DPI as a major kind of all of government effort, both in terms of promoting the value of digital public infrastructure and also kind of sharing Indian best practices and trying to export those as solutions themselves to various parts of the world. So when we talk about DPIs, I think that is another potential way to assess whether this joint statement that talks about technology is something that is manifesting in terms of whether actual solutions have been exported and whether kind of ideas and solutions conceptualized in India are taking place in other parts of the world. Again, I don't think there is a question that can assess this fairly, because there are so many other factors at play that will result in these outcomes or not. But in terms of the initiative being there itself, I think is something to celebrate for now, and then we kind of see to what extent the perceptions among businesses improve, and in certain cases there are real life solutions that we can speak of.
Before I move back to Nitin, I want to just ask a quick question on what do you think the ISAT's effects will be on technology policy making in India? The government just passed a Data Protection Act. There's still some work to be done on cybersecurity and AI. Do you think this will create an urgency to move those processes along further?
So my understanding is not as much as one might think, because of what I was talking about earlier, that there is kind of a segregation between the security lens of cooperation and kind of domestic policy making. So again, when we talk about India's positions at several trade forums, the constant refrain has been that domestic policy making space needs to be protected to the extent possible. And even cases where Indian policy and now law has changed to make it more in line with what the US, especially the commerce side, wants, that's been always referred to as this is what Indian startups want. So a great example is data localization, right? Where, of course, the personal data protection bill in its various iterations had varying degrees of requirements of restrictions. This particular law that was passed last week is least restrictive. So it just says that if you're not blacklisted, data can flow. But of course, the existing data localization mandates, most notably the Reserve Bank of India's directive, is still in force. So this does not prejudice existing sectoral mandates. But even this relaxation, when Indian ministers speak about it, the idea is always, we are trying to do what is best for Indian startups. So this overarching notion that just because there is convergence and cooperation with the US and other countries on the security realm does not automatically mean that Indian policy stances will change. On cybersecurity and AI as well, I think there has been, and I spoke about kind of the data governance, data protection angle, which I think has largely been a product of what this bill, that I think there was a question as well, this bill is a product of what the government thinks is useful for the country based on the interests largely of Indian stakeholders. When you move to cybersecurity and AI, there's been a national cybersecurity strategy that I believe is existent but not been published for several reasons, and that's anyone's guess as to why it's not been published. But that security strategy does exist, and that does kind of shape how Indian institutions function. But again, I don't think the stimulus is external at all. The stimulus has been that India thinks that cybersecurity is a threat. Similarly, on AI, I think again there has been a number of policy documents published by Niti Aayog, and progressively, I think they've been quite good in terms of articulating both the kind of economic value of artificial intelligence and data, and also kind of increasingly thinking about how that aligns with India's constitutional framework. But again, I'm not sure if there is an external impetus to that, and whether the ICT will either change Indian policy stances by itself or alter the speed at which policies is being made. I very much think that we need to look at them as two separate things that feed into the relationship, and there are separate institutions and coordination mechanisms that deal with each of them. Just a final point on kind of the multilateral, and this is a point that I was trying to make, I forgot to make earlier. Nitin mentioned the Artemis Accords that India signed, and of course, there was a lot of conversation around that. One of the potential kind of roadblocks was that, Artemis Accords is not a UN brokered multilateral initiative. It's US brokered. And similarly, I think the Paris call for trust and security in cyberspace was brokered by Microsoft and the French government. And for a long time, both US and India did not sign it for various reasons. The US has signed it recently, but the fact that India has shown flexibility in signing the Artemis Accords means that a lot of these when we on cyber norms for responsible state behavior when it comes to cybersecurity, there are of course the UN processes, but a number of multi-stakeholder processes as well that both India and US could get involved with, and kind of Artemis Accords equivalence in some way in cybersecurity realm. And I think that this signing, which was of course brokered through in some ways the Prime Minister's visit, this signing could push India to accept or sign up to more of these agreements, simply also because they don't actually constrain domestic policy making space in any way. So to sum up, it could have implications for how India perceives some global agreements, as long as it doesn't change or restrict or constrain domestic policy making space. I don't think that is something that India would want to surrender because of the ISAT or the political goodwill that was generated out of the Prime Minister's visit. But I'm not sure if you or Nitin disagree.
Nitin, when you were here in Singapore a few months ago and you gave a talk on India's technology transformation, I remember you mentioned that a lot of the efforts, a lot of the motivations and logics that's driving the government's technology policies and plans was this desire to create an alternate technology pole in the world, like the United States, the EU, China. But the Indian model is one that's centered on open source systems in a global information order. So the government is not really beholden to any one private actor or any big tech company. How do you think this budding US-India tech partnership affects those plans?
In fact, I think that in a broadest sense, the Indian approach allows for the United States and India to present a counter to the closed, centralized model which China presents, right? If you look at the global information order, I think we're seeing two, and I mentioned this when I was in Singapore as well, we are seeing two models being put forth, right? There is an open, free information order, and then there's a closed, centralized information order. And there's a contestation between the two. And, the two powers, United States and China, probably represent the political dimension of these things. But if you are a US company and you want to sell, systems to a Southeast Asian economy, so let's say Southeast Asian country or government, the government is going to look at it and say, look, we know what you guys did to the Russians in Ukraine. The moment Washington and Moscow fell out of love, and there was these sanctions, you just cut off all our connections, right? You treated us as Russian customers like dirt. You just kicked us out, and we are very wary of that now, right? So, and I think you even if they don't express it in as stark terms as I did, this is a worry at the back of the minds of every sovereign state. It's also on the minds of big private companies around the world, that how much does our dependence on American technology, on American firms like Microsoft, Google, Amazon, how much of it is contingent on Washington's whim and fancy, right? Which also is whim and fancy, also known as foreign policy, right? So if you now want to go and challenge the closed, you want to challenge China in these circumstances, it's going to be very hard. So a model which is the third way, which my friend Rahul Mathan is an upcoming book is called The Third Way, or the Indian Way, where you're basically going out to the governments and saying, look, let's use open technologies as much as possible. These are just as far as possible open source. Even if they are not open source, in some cases they're open access. So anybody could come and join. So the semantics on what is open source, open access, what is open technologies, it can get into a very hot debate. We can spend 3 days discussing these things, but the overall idea is that it's not proprietary, right? It is not controlled by an individual private corporation or a consortium of corporations or by the government, right? It's available out there, and you can do things on your own. And this offers all countries a fantastic opportunity to stay in the free and open information order, but yet not rely on big technology companies, which are predominantly American, right? Now, what does this mean in terms of business practices, right? If there's an open system which is going to be implemented in a Southeast Asian country, every country has a chance to participate in implementing it, right? So it could be a Singapore company, it could be an Indian company, a US company. Some of them will form consortiums with each other. Some of them will bid on their own, but there's going to be competition, and there's food on the table for a lot of companies rather than only from companies from one country, which we would find in a closed system, right? So I think in long and short of this is that the Indian model offers India and the United States another way, probably a more attractive way to reach out to third countries and deploy systems.
Anujit, I want to bring you in here, but get you to talk a little bit about the newly passed Data Protection Act. Can India, as Nitin mentioned, serve as an example for other developing countries with a law that seems to, at least at face value, expand the power of the state when it comes to data governance?
Yeah, I think first, I agree with what Nitin said. I think that there is a need for kind of a third way approach to technology governance, and also a third way approach to forging partnerships in the technology realm. So, a lot of countries don't want to pick between US technology and Chinese technology, including in Southeast Asia, where there has been studies on Indonesia which suggest that, even if there are surveillance with, say, surveillance concerns with Chinese technology, there could also be surveillance concerns with technology being provided by Five Eyes countries. So there is a desire to kind of cooperate wherever necessary with both the poles, and consequently also think of what ideologically a third way would look like. On that front, I think one is the Indian approach has been characterized by, rather than ideologically kind of preaching at forums such as the United Nations First Committee, where the kind of contestation has played out quite vividly over the last 2 decades, where there is this one idea of a control system, the other idea of a multi-stakeholder open internet, also debates on whether the existing rules and laws of international law apply to cyberspace, which is what the US and its allies want, and then on the other hand, Russia and China and others want new cyber laws to be created because they, in some ways, they want to reject the existing regime. India has been largely silent on that ideological divide. At the same time, especially the recent Indian submissions to the open-ended working group at the UN, and also India's DPI diplomacy, has been about saying that the ideology that we profess is based on real solutions that have been tested and piloted and potentially been successful within India. So DPI is a great example. I spoke about that, but even the proposals made at the UN First Committee have been things like, can we create a global capacity building portal? So this third way of approaching technology policy is not just ideology itself of being built on open source and being built in a way that factors in development, but it is also about actually kind of showing real solutions that can be successfully applied world over. Within that context, I think the data protection bill, yeah, I think what you said makes absolute sense. The fact that there are exemptions given to government that are not in line with constitutional law or international human rights law poses a challenge. I mean, not just in terms of, selling this model ideologically, but also in terms of when there are, say, negotiations on access to data stored in the US or in the EU. This surveillance law consideration is highlighted quite often by the negotiators from the other side. The fact that India needs more surveillance control, and to be very honest, like surveillance itself in some ways is organized hypocrisy, where everyone wants to surveil as much as possible while still couching it in human rights. The US, EU spat on data flows is an example of that as well. But yeah, I think that a law, this is not to say that the data protection law is all bad. There are realistic controls that are imposed on data processors in terms of granting consent rights to data principals and so on. So it's definitely a step in the right direction. But the kind of that one thorn that keeps on sticking out, I think, is the excessive powers given to government to conduct surveillance or access data. And like as I said, it's not like the US has a perfect surveillance regime, especially when it comes to surveillance conducted on foreigners. It's not like the EU has a perfect surveillance regime that governs intelligence agencies either, especially when it comes to the EU member states, even though the EU has been much more active in trying to counter US-based surveillance. So it is in many ways hypocrisy from all sides, but still that said, controls on government is always good, regardless of which jurisdiction we are talking about. And on that potential issue, the bill does fall short. But I mean, I do think that there is value in looking at these two questions as separately as well. Is this provision in the bill problematic? Of course it is. But at the same time, that doesn't negate any of what Nitin said, or the fact that India continues, despite this kind of thorn, as I mentioned, continues to offer a realistic alternate solution, and consequently, through that solution, driving an alternate ideology in terms of how the internet should be governed, which is not by big tech, not by states, but through open standards. In a way, it is by rooting it in indigenized solutions, it is an extension of the European way, which at least professedly is based on individual rights much more. But again, if we're talking about individual rights exist against corporations, but equally against the governments. And I think potentially that is going to be a sticking point. But I mean, as I've said before, India, while it does not change policy based on external impetus, it has been reflective to domestic consultations. The fact that the law took 6 years to come into force is an example of that. So, you never know what the amendments would look like and whether the rules and notifications would actually kind of address some of the concerns that you addressed, and I think that are valid as well. So, yeah.
Great, thank you. So let's now move into the Q&A with the audience. I encourage all our participants online to send us your questions through the chat function. We already have one. And it's on the data protection law, which was just passed. So maybe I'll pose it to both of you. Does the data privacy law have any impact on the partnership, the US-India partnership? Maybe start with Arundarjit and then I'll go to Nitin.
Yeah, I'll be quick because I think the last question kind of feeds into this. I don't think independently the act would be something that has a concrete impact on the partnership as it stands now. As I said, it's largely been in the security realm. India has been hesitant to surrender domestic policy space on it. But I'll just kind of highlight some of the concerns that have been addressed repeatedly by the US Trade Representative on India's data protection ecosystem over the ages, and to what extent the law addresses that. As I mentioned, the data localization provision, I think, would be something that the US would like, because while it does not do away with the sectoral notifications, and it can't do that, it does not impose any additional restrictions on cross-border flow. So that's great. That's something that they would like. It does have a cybersecurity element, which is great on breach notifications. Again, something that they would like. I think the consistent kind of concern that has been raised in a trade context is, as Karthik was alluding to, the fact that whether there is excessive government control of information flows, and the question is whether this particular bill does enough to do that. I think, again, the US would probably say no. So there are things that the US would like, things that the US would not like, but I don't think that this will in any way impact the larger thinking behind the partnership, or in any way, mean step backs for the other wins that have been made in the security sector and so on and so forth. So that's largely my take in a nutshell. Because there are ways in which the law can be improved and given more clarity and so on and so forth. Hopefully that will be done through future amendments and through future rules, but that does not mean that there will be an impact on the US-India partnership as it stands today.
Nitin?
I have nothing to add. He's summarized it so well that I can't improve on what he's already done.
But one question that I think a lot of people abroad will be looking at, and I'm sure a lot of folks in Singapore will be thinking about, is how the government is going to determine data flows between countries. What kind of criteria will the MEA now come up with to negotiate and sign those bilateral data agreements so personal data flows can occur seamlessly? How quickly do you think this will happen between the US and other countries like Singapore? And do you expect any barriers here?
See, I think first of all, as a former technology regulator, one thing which I've sort of learned is that all regulatory boundaries in technology are artificial, right? So when you have a law called, and when you have licensed something called an internet service provider, an ISP, right? And I mean, everybody now understands what an ISP is, and there's an ISP license, etc. But in 1995, there were no such things as ISPs, right? So the idea that there is a business called an internet service provision, which is distinguished from the telecoms layer and which is distinguished from the content layer, is an artificial construction, right? It is a regulatory construct. So I think the challenge in these times is to arrive at similar regulatory constructs for data flows, right? I've been one of the most strident opponents of data localization, because I don't think data localization is either makes sense or is in India's interests. But in a way, in a world where data and the exploitation of data becomes a route to economic and political power, I think every nation state has an obligation to figure out that the data within its domain and control is not used in a way that undermines its interests, right? So you will have to figure out ways to determine what are the neat regulatory boxes for data. Now, the test of this is not whether it is theoretically elegant or technologically, whether it has any kind of thing. It's whether it is functional, right? Can you get the particular determination of what is data in India, what is data in the United States, where does the flow take place? If those definitions are functional, you're in the game, and then they should be accepted by all your partners, right? Those are the two tests that you need to pass, not conceptual elegance, which all of us have been trained to look for.
Do you want to add something to that, Anujeet? Data flows?
Yeah, absolutely. I think Nitin is right. I think that data localization is always looked at as a kind of stimulus in its own right. Whereas I think that the concept itself is more of a symptom of a global data access and data sharing system that's broken, right? You have, I think the number is 2,700 data centers in the United States. Therefore, the United States has territorial jurisdiction over data stored in almost 3,000 data centers, whereas India has, I think, 138 data centers. The second highest number of data centers is in the UK, right? So, of course, one is the economic aspect. The second is, and I think this has been repeated several times, but I think we need to stress on this, is that the main challenge remains that when there are legitimate law enforcement investigations being conducted for a crime in India, the victim is Indian, the alleged perpetrator is Indian, but the data needs to be accessed by the law enforcement official through laws in the US, and the mutual legal assistance treaty process that still operates is essentially broken, where you need anywhere between 12 months to a year to access that valuable piece of data, right? So data localization was in many ways a pushback against a system which does not allow equitable sharing. So when Nitin was speaking about how do we, as then a country, while data localization obviously has costs, including costs for Indian businesses, something that the government has recognized, there is this other challenge that needs to be figured out of how do we access data in a manner that does not hamper investigations, and I think that balance needs to be struck. So just on the data localization provision in the bill itself, potentially is a way of trying to strike this balance. The previous iteration, even in 2022, was one that required countries to be explicitly whitelisted, which would mean that the government would need to notify you as a country to which data could flow. This is exactly what the EU has, by the way. That's whitelisting is basically another form of EU adequacy. But now it's shifted where one could argue that the data flow regime in India is more liberal than the GDPR, because it's actually shifted to a blacklisting situation where unless your country is blacklisted, data would flow freely. So again, how do we determine the blacklist would be a mix, of course, of security and economic concerns. I don't think that this blacklisting process would be used as a diplomatic tool to say, oh, because data is not freely flowing from your country to mine, I will therefore blacklist. I think this is largely going to be a security issue where data would maybe not flow freely to adversaries. But yeah, I think when we consider even beyond the bill, when we consider India's data localization strategies, it has to be a kind of balancing of competing equities. But just to end with, I think the recent history, the history of the RBI data localization directive has shown that foreign technology companies ultimately are okay with accepting Indian data localization realities because the Indian market is simply too attractive to exit. So when the RBI directive came about 5 years back, there was a lot of opposition. There continues to be concerted lobbying. There was issues where MasterCard and American diners and so on didn't comply with it. They were restricted from issuing new cards, and then now everyone's complied and everyone has reoriented the systems to comply with that directive. So it shows that despite the RBI directive that is in force, that logically and theoretically, as Nitin was saying, doesn't make the most sense. When we look at it practically, companies have figured out a way to comply, to continue doing fraud detection, to continue processing data. And that goes to show that, one of the strengths that India has when balancing competing equities is simply the brute size of the Indian market. Now, again, if you look at it from a rights perspective, the market getting things done, it may not be the most efficient way, but in diplomacy, it's worked. Right now, if you talk to any company today, they'll say, yes, we have to comply with the law of the land, whether it's the localization directive, whether it's the kind of access to data that the government requires, whether we think it's legitimate or not, we have to comply with it because we can't risk losing the Indian market. And that's a major strength that India has. It's India's job, I think, to use that strength responsibly in a way that helps all citizens. So, yeah.
We have another question from Nishant. The US spends significantly more on technology R&D than India. Do you think this will slow cooperation on tech, especially joint projects? Maybe Nitin first.
Yeah, I think the view that that view of manpower, the presumption, that question, I think needs to change a bit, because the actual number of people working on high-end R&D in the United States is pretty small, right? Compared to the workforce or the tech workforce in the United States. So what really the partnership is about getting the tech workforces or the larger workforces in the two countries to work together and do interesting things, right? So the size of the tech force is what we're talking about, not so much about where the innovation comes from. In fact, you could even argue that the geography of the actual R&D is not as important as the geography where that R&D, the particular innovation is translated into products and services and then distributed to the rest of the world, right? So I'll give you an interesting piece. I was at a conference somewhere and I said, this was about semiconductors, and I said, look, I live in Bangalore, and I'm pretty sure that there are 5,000 semiconductor engineers in and around me, right? In my city, there are about 5,000 easily. If you want to go somewhere and recruit 5,000 high-end chip designers, you just come to Bangalore, and there are 5,000 to be had. My colleague messaged me while I was in the conference and said, you got it wrong. The number is closer to 75,000, right? So you're talking about close to 100,000 high-end semiconductor designers in India, 75,000 of whom are in Bangalore, right? So if you're looking at high-end talent in numbers that can swing move the needle globally, India is your only place, right? And the idea that these are low productivity is not quite accurate, because you're not talking about the average, the Indian average for a workforce. You're talking about the technology industry average, and that's in the world-class standards, right? That's in the top league. So I would not think that that aspect will make a lot of difference to, at least it's not a negative factor.
Ardhajit, there was very little talk coming out of the visit on coordinating tech policies at multilateral organizations. The joint statement did highlight that both countries should work together to develop some standards on AI, but that's about it. What do you think the takeaway is for global tech governance on issues like state behavior online, data, cybersecurity, AI, and digital trade, which, as you mentioned, was not going anywhere?
Yeah, I mean, the digital trade question, I think it could go somewhere depending on how the US-India Trade Policy Forum and the US-India Commercial Dialogue progress. I think from the Indian side, it's the Commerce Ministry Representative Piyush Goyal, and then on the US side, it's the US Trade Representative Catherine Tai and Gina Raimondo, respectively. So it depends on that. And as of now, we've not seen any evidence of a convergence on that front. But let me take each of these regimes or rulemaking initiatives separately, because as you rightly mentioned in your book, it's maybe more difficult to come up with a theoretical approach that or an ideology that applies to all negotiating forums, but actually it's better to go kind of issue by issue and see what are the factors at play within each issue. So on the first one, which is largely at the UN First Committee multilaterally on disarmament and international security that fosters responsible state behavior in cyberspace. As I said, the US is very much part of the ideological bloc with the NATO allies and the West, broadly speaking, that wants information flows, that wants existing rules to apply to cyberspace. And then there's the other bloc, Russia, China, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization as well. There's a Shanghai Cooperation Organization statement that India has not signed on kind of how to govern cyberspace to more of a information sovereignty perspective that basically gives the state the right. So India has been, I mean, ideologically agnostic in the sense that it has been very clear about not opting into either of these blocks. So India's contributions have been much more focused on capacity building, on things like secure supply chains, on safeguarding critical infrastructure, so on and so forth. There has been no indication that India wants to go into either of these blocks, and this is how it's going to stay. So for global tech governance at large, it means that in any case, I think the first committee is a bit stymied right now because of what's happening in Ukraine. So I don't think that there is going to be much progress made anyway by 2025. And I don't think that the Indian or US positions will diverge greatly. Same on digital trade and so on. So rather than looking at what this means for tech governance writ large in terms of coming up with rules and laws, I think what we need to think about is that will there be pockets of convergence for the purpose of getting things done? So the Quad statement on principles for responsible technology use and so on, I think that is the bare minimum that the countries need to agree to in order to have cooperation that involves citizens and companies and so on. It is not particularly advanced. It does not compel countries to change their regulations, but it does put together an approach that largely is something that reflects the values of the four Quad countries, right? So again, I think the future is going to be India and US will both make their multilateral choices, vote the way they see fit. And if there is a situation where interests align, then sure, that could lead to a convergence in voting. But as of now, there is no indication that there is going to be ideological convergence, but that does not mean that bare minimum threshold for standards in terms of protecting privacy, safeguarding security, there being some reference to the core ethical AI principles on fairness, accountability, transparency, and so on. I think those will continue to be there without changing where ideologically both India and US fit in. So I think that's how I see this relationship taking global tech governance forward. It's again based more on interests and perceptions of both countries rather than the relationship itself driving some sort of tech governance change.
We have about 10 minutes left. So I have a couple of broad questions for each of our speakers to end with. The first, so there's a sense when you're looking at India's technology and digital initiatives and achievements that the government is really placing a big bet on techno-solutionism, that a lot of policy problems can be resolved through the digital revolution, through innovation, which also requires a massive expansion of state power and a state business nexus. This is most visible in the area of digital public goods delivery, and that's happening through DPIs. Do you agree with this assessment, and do you find this trend problematic? Maybe I'll start with Nitin first.
Well, thanks for asking that. Look, I am having spent a lot of my life, first half of my career in tech. I do know that the way tech is designed, deployed, and presumed to work is not quite the way it really happens. And the social consequences of technology are often, the unintended social consequences are, often not anticipated, and therefore leads you to a lot of problems. Having said that, I think the context where, in the context of India and the Indian state, I think the charges of techno-solutionism are premature. They're premature because you have a state that is severely under capacity, right? You don't have enough police, you don't have enough fire people, you don't have enough doctors, you don't have enough district collectors, you just don't have enough of anybody, right? So, and given that the pace at which the population is increasing and we are urbanizing, and the kind of political and economic change that is happening in society, you need large numbers of well-trained people to form the crew, which is called the government. And we just don't have that, right? And the political economy is such that you can't even increase that very easily, right? Without suffering other consequences. So using tech is certainly a governance imperative. You've got to use the tools that you have available to fix the problems that you have, right? So using tech, therefore, whether it's through delivering public distribution through electronic means, or cash transfers, or electronic processing of data, all of that is no. But what I find very amusing is that in most countries you'll call this digital government, e-government, and all that, and celebrate it. But you'll have a lot of people saying, "Oh, this is techno-solutionism" when it happens in India, right? And many of us Indians ourselves are part of that critique. I think we've got to be very, very careful in seeing this. There's a lot of ideological baggage which informs this. There's also the trajectory of some of the battles which have been fought in the last 15 years, which informs this view. But if you're objective about this, you'll find that in general, some of the most prominent technology platforms that the government has introduced have resulted in improvement over the status quo, right? That's your test. Your test is whether the tech improves the status quo or not. Now, once it does, of course, you'll have some side effects which you'll have to tackle. And sometimes the government is bad at this. Sometimes it doesn't want to tackle it. But the fact is that your status quo has improved, right? A property transaction today is much faster and is much safer than it used to be 10 years ago, right? Getting a loan, and you could say that, there are these people in, in some remote district who don't have certain credentials, which is why life is difficult for them, which is, I totally agree. That is a problem of exclusion, and digital sometimes has made it more complicated. But for those of those of us, the people who are, who are in the mainstream, right? Things have improved tremendously, right? In terms of payments and transfers and getting things. I'll give you just one example before I end, right? People don't understand what the social implication of technology is. There's a lot of criticism about the payments infrastructure, right? United Payments Infrastructure, whatever, UPI. I don't even know what it's called now, right? So a lot of people now can transfer, 500 rupees, 100 rupees, or large numbers of money on this. And there was once a conversation and someone said, what's the big deal? You could go to a bank in a village and draw that amount of money and pay it to somebody else. You could have done that. There's, UPI didn't make a big difference. There's one person who got up and said, look, I can't walk into a village bank, right? And even if you're walking into a big bank in a big city, the kind of clothes you wear, how you look, the way you speak will make a big difference to the kind of service that you get. And that's not just in India, that's in Singapore as well, right? I mean, I walked into a DBS wealth management bank with shorts, and then they were like wondering, who's the boss, right? So it's not just in India, it's everywhere else, right? But with digital, you're just immediately, you're liberated from that prison of your status, your wealth, and so on, and your dignity is disconnected from the transaction. And that's happening massively with many of the things which are happening in digital, right? And that's a story which is not being told, largely because people who need to study these kind of stories are very consumed in opposition to technology, right? And I agree there are very good reasons to be opposed to technology, but I think a lot of these people are not doing their jobs well.
Yeah.
Arjit, yeah.
Yeah, I think I largely agree with Nitin. I think it's also difficult to make a overall assessment of whether Indian government or the Indian kind of thinking is techno-solutionist or whether it's appropriate. I think we need to look at specific examples of things that have worked and specific examples of things that could be improved. I think the test, of course, one is, as Nitin mentioned, how do are there multiple examples of things that have worked? And I think there are. And of course, the United Payments Interface, I think, is the if I'm not mistaken. But that's an example of something that's worked. In Bangalore, I'm sure Nitin has used it as well. There is this new ONDC powered application for that is backed by the auto unions called Namayatri, which actually cuts out the middleman in the gig economy. So you don't have to pay a commission to Uber or Ola or whatever. You directly pay through UPI or in cash to the person driving the auto, which is great, right? It's great for customers. It's great for the auto drivers themselves, the gig workers themselves, right? So I think again there are things that where tech can be used to kind of improve upon problems that exist in society and also improve upon problems caused by tech itself. Namayatri is an example of that, where the challenges brought about by the gig economy and the negative impact on workers is improved to whatever extent, right? So I think that's one thing to say. I think the first test is, of course, have certain things worked. I think the second test, and this is again, Nitin was alluding to this, that there is opposition to it. There is, in some cases, valid opposition to it. To what extent have the things that have not worked taken into account of valid opposition to it and improved itself, right? I think that's the test that will determine whether a particular measure is successful or not. So the opposition is, of course, on the broader idea whether tech is, an appropriate solution also, and whether there are enough of rights that are being respected and so on. And I think that is really the test of the use of tech by government in any democracy, right? Whether the opposition is able to hear, opposition is not in the political sense, but opposition as in the critical sense, that are they able to hear their voices heard? And I think that is going to be the test going forward, whether the things that we think aren't working so well or are potentially examples of cases where tech should not have been used, whether they are consequently improved or taken away. And I think that's really the test that will determine the answer to that question. So I don't want to weigh in on yes or no, but I think those are the two tests. As Nitin first mentioned, are there significant things that work? And second, the things that don't work, is there ways in which the government takes criticism on board and improves them?
Great. My final question, and please feel free to be as brief as possible or expand. What will the US-India technology relationship look like in a decade? Maybe I'll start with Arjit first and then end with Nitin.
I think the security cooperation that is on the technology front that has started will, I think, be turbocharged with meaningful cooperation and investment by the private sector on both sides. I think the workforce point that Nitin made, I think, is of course I fully agree with him, but I think the second part of the question that was there is, will is there enough funding for research in India? I think that's really one of the determining questions for the future on any of the technology planks, right? Whether there is enough funding for R&D, of course, at the private sector level, and also will there enough investments be made for advanced research at the university level as well? So how much can the IITs and the private colleges and so on kind of opt into that ecosystem and benefit from it? I think that's one crucial test, but I think largely we will see kind of turbocharging on the security front. I think on the trade front, it's very difficult to make a prediction on that. I think that, as I said, there is differences in opinion on how domestic policy should function in both countries on data protection, on data governance and so on, and some areas for potential convergence. I think, again, the catalyst for that and the determining criteria for that is to what extent there can be exemptions made even if rules are agreed upon. So, for example, if there is an FTA that does agree to cross-border flows between India and the US, and India has signed an FTA, for example, with UAE, to what extent is the wording kind of ambiguous enough, or is there enough exemption for genuine interests to allow restrictions if countries agree? So I think that is a function of the trade and policy convergence will in many ways be a function of diplomacy. At the multilateral level, I think it'll be much of the same. And I think both the US negotiators and India accepts it, right? And this is not just in the tech front. So initially, for example, India's stance on the Ukraine war, initially there was some opposition from the US, but ultimately I think every senior leader going up all the way to Blinken has said, we accept it. This is how India thinks, and we are absolutely okay with that. So I think multilaterally there will be divergence on certain ideological issues potentially, or a lack of convergence, even if there is no divergence. And I think that will continue to be the case, and that won't change the overarching idea of getting things done, which I think is the overall purpose of the ICET, the Quad, and the joint statement, the highest political relationship between India and the US. So I was maybe a little bit longer than I expected to be, but yeah, over to Nitin.
Nitin, the last word is yours.
Yeah, I have a very short one. I think in 10 years, it'll be normalized. We'll just forget about it. We won't be excited. It'll be just one of those normal things which happen. Like taking a flight from here to New York, right? It's not a big deal. When the flight was new, it was exciting. But now you just get onto a flight and go, you're just complaining about food and, things like that. But it's going to be normalized in 10 years.
Great. I want to thank Nitin and Andarjit for joining us and for an invigorating discussion on the US-India tech relationship and partnership that really extended into far more areas than build. Needless to say, we need to keep track of India's technology transformation and its partnership with the US, which will affect not only India's digital journey, but also the broader geopolitics in the Indo-Pacific that's increasingly becoming fractious, especially on the tech side. And thank you all for joining us this afternoon.